There's a problem. I used to serve as the president for the American Institute of Architects in my state, and I found that all of the projects that were receiving these big awards that would come out every year and be published in all the glossy magazines were projects that had big fat budgets, because the way that those problems were getting solved, those projects were getting solved, is by extolling huge amounts of money onto very expensive materials. That's not good design. Good design is using those things that God gave us, those aesthetic things that we all inherently appreciate, that we can use intelligently on the buildings that we're tasked to come up with in a stewardship way. We want to make sure that we address this whole notion of flexibility. Plan on change. In today's culture, change is going to happen. If it's not, somebody will figure out a reason for it to happen. Change needs to be accommodated. We want to make sure that we're integrating the services. We want to make sure that we understand intelligently about the HVAC systems and the electrical systems. We found a lot of churches were building buildings and inheriting systems that they simply couldn't afford to operate, or they couldn't afford the expertise that they had taken on for these kinds of systems. And so we're trying to think intelligently about the way that we think through things like HVAC control systems. Let's come up with something that churches can actually use, not just something theoretically that sits in the corner. Controls on an HVAC system, heating, ventilating, and air conditioning system, can actually halve your budget if you think intelligently about the way you control your systems. This is a little bit of an aside, but I don't know how many of you have looked at your electrical bills. In most jurisdictions nowadays, about a third to a half of the electrical bill comes out in the form of demand charges. So those are the peak time demand charges that get charged to an electrical bill. And the big savings nowadays is to reduce the amount of demand charges. If you can think through systems that talk to one another and allows you to avoid those demand charges, we can cut a dramatic amount. For $500 to $800 of investment up front, we can, in a 2 or 3 month time period, save on our electrical bills to reap that savings. So we need to think about the way that we service our buildings. We want to make sure that we address this whole notion of construction costs. The normal project nowadays runs through this process of going out and getting it bid. In today's market, of course, we're experiencing deflation or flat construction, but it is a pandemic out there where the building committee will sit down with the architect and say, design us this building, and then they find out that they're 30% or 20% short in their budget. We want to make sure that we learn from that and that we're addressing those issues up front. We want to avoid change orders. I don't know if you know what a change order is, but a change order comes as a change of direction happens in the plans, either from an unforeseen condition or a change in scope or whatever it is. And at that point in time, change orders cause all kinds of havoc to building budgets. So we want to avoid change orders. We want to avoid the whole notion of lost time. Time translates into money when it comes to construction. And so we want to think intelligently about the way that we sequence our projects, the way that we put them together. The world's way of building can be a very frustrating experience. I don't know how many of you have been built through building projects, either through your house or through your church. But at the end of the day, we've had to be very careful with our projects, because we find that the normal experience is there's a lot of mistrust as we walk through the door the very first time, because they've been through a very frustrating event in the past, and we want to make sure that we avoid those frustrating experiences. Ministries become weary, physically and mentally spent when we don't pay attention to things and do these things in God's way. And we want to emphasize that there should be a process that works for churches. Unfortunately, the process in the past has been, tell us what your budget is, we'll do what we can to keep it within 10 or 20% of that. They start the process, and at the end of it all, the church oftentimes feels excluded from what the process was all about. We want to make sure that we come up with something that's incorporating. So let's talk about that. The 20th century project delivery model, we believe, creates a lot of distrust, a lot of distance, a lot of dilution, certainly as we go through, and it can be disaster. And as it's portrayed here, it sometimes is a house of cards type of proposition. And we certainly want to avoid that, because at the end of the day, if you're trying to build a building to fulfill the needs of a ministry, and the ministries are destroyed by the very thing that you're seeking, it is a failure on everybody's part, and we've got to somehow avoid that. You'll find that the normal process too, where the architect is hired early on, and then at some point along the line, 3 or 4 months down the road, the engineers are incorporated into the project. Finally, the general contractor or the construction manager is brought into the process at the end of the drawing phase through a competitive bid or through some other process. And then finally, the trades get hired. And you'll see in the next slide that oftentimes the process stacks up like this, where you have the architect, you have the owner, and you have the general contractor, and you have these big brick walls dividing us. So if the plumber wants to ask a question, the plumber has to go up the food chain to the general contractor, back through the owner, back to the architect, and the owner oftentimes in these situations becomes the mediator between a warring architect and a warring general contractor. A very unpleasant situation for a church to find themselves. So what we have found intuitively is that if we can get to the people, and we find this actually in Exodus 35, if you read that story sometime, those stories portray to us that these are not subcontracting trades that we're dealing with, but these are craftsmen, and they need to be brought in at a point in time where we can learn from them. That's a hard thing for an architect to admit, is that I don't know everything about all these projects. I need to allow those that know more about their trade than I do. I have a general understanding of their trade, but the specific trades is where value can be found. So in our next slide, we talk about this whole notion too. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. This whole notion of integrated services. We want to integrate the builder, the architect, and the owner, and the subcontractors at a point in time before the prices are established, before we go too far. And we want to make sure that we are talking to one another so that we can, again, search for value. Back to that stewardship notion. The old way of design, bid, build on the left, you see the little diagram on the left. Design, bid, build is first the architect is hired. He responds to the owner's questions. Oftentimes, the architect at that point is being paid on the percentage of the cost of construction. So the architect is raising his hand and say, well, dream and dream big, because I'm getting paid on the basis of a percentage of the cost of construction of what's designed. It's a conflict of interest. And so the architect and the contractor are merrily rolling along, and then at some point in time bring that contractor into that realm. We found that to be a process that delivers a low upfront cost. That's a great thing, because that's a stewardship-based decision. But at the end of the day, it's fraught with change orders and fraught with litigation and fighting. Relationships are damaged. And so on the response to the design, bid, build industry on the diagram on the far right has been design, build. The owners got tired of being the mediator, and the owner said, okay, you, Mr. Builder, go out and hire an architect and bring the architect in, or work with this architect and form this shotgun marriage and come in and form one contractual entity. That's the design build realm. Owners like design build because design build means I don't have to listen to the bickering that goes on between a warring architect and the contractor, and I don't have to deal with change orders. But unfortunately, they pay about 15% more for their projects. For that privilege of not listening to that and being that mediator, we're going to pay more for the project. Public agencies like that because they don't have to deal with the litigation aspect of it. But for a church, sometimes at the end of the process, I was talking to a church the other day that had been through a design build project, and they said, we just felt distanced from the whole thing. We felt like the decisions were getting made not on the basis of what was right for the church, but financially what was right for the contractor. So we have found that design build for churches oftentimes is not an appropriate response. The appropriate response we found is where the owner, the architect, and the builder form three distinct entities, so separate contracts from architect to owner, builder to owner, but agree to work together and agree to put God in the center of the decision-making process. We're going to work together as Christians, and we're going to resolve the obstacles that will come, and we're going to do it together, honoring and glorifying God in the process. And so if we do that, and we are seeking to prosper the ministries of the church as a common goal, we have a much greater chance of success in our process.